The arrows came first, hissing out of the red rocks like a nest of snakes disturbed, and Grandma Ashwalker was already moving before the first one struck the lead ox in the throat. She swung down from the wagon rail with her falchion already drawn, the curved blade catching the dying light of the canyon sun, and put herself between the screaming animal and the 3 Ashwalker warriors who had ridden with her from the highlands. Bloodfang raiders poured down the switchback trail on foot, painted in soot and dried blood, howling Gurak's name like a war drum. "Shields to the wagon," Grandma bellowed, her voice cracking off the canyon walls. "Protect the crates or none of us eat this winter." She did not wait to see if they obeyed. She never had. She met the first raider with a downward cut that split his spear half in two, then drove her shoulder into his chest and put him on the ground hard enough that he did not get up again. A second came at her from the flank, and she caught his axe on her forearm guard, the bone-jarring impact numbing her hand, and answered with a kick to his knee that folded him sideways into the rocks. It was the third one, the big one with the notched warhammer and Gurak's black sigil painted across his chest, who nearly ended her. She saw him coming and misjudged the swing by half a heartbeat, tired from the 2 before him, and the hammer's haft caught her across the jaw instead of the killing blow he had meant for her skull. Bone cracked. Pain exploded white behind her eyes. She tasted blood and ivory splinters and knew, even as she staggered, that one of her tusks had broken. She did not fall. She drove her falchion up under the raider's ribs before he could swing again, twisted the blade with a warrior's cruel efficiency, and let him drop. Then she turned, spitting blood onto the red stone, and looked at the rest of Gurak's men still coming down the slope. "Who is next?" she said, and her voice did not shake even though half her jaw was fire and ruin. "Come feed the ground. I am not finished." Whatever courage the raiders had brought with them broke faster than her tusk had. They scattered back up into the rocks, dragging their wounded, cursing her name in the raw bloodfang tongue, and left her standing in the road with 2 dead men at her feet, her escort battered but breathing, and 1 wagon of grain and medicine crates rocking on its axles behind her. It was in that condition, blood sheeting from her jaw down the front of her leathers, 1 tusk snapped jagged just past the gum line, that Grandma Ashwalker walked the last mile into the canyon settlement of Rimrock Hollow to be presented as a bride to a man she had never met. The gate guards saw her first, a lone armored shape striding out of the heat shimmer with 2 exhausted warriors and a groaning wagon behind her, and one of them nearly loosed an arrow before recognizing the Ashwalker banner tied to the wagon rail. Shouting went up along the cliff walkways. Someone ran for the healer's cabin cut into the canyon rock near the well square, because whatever else this orc woman was, she was bleeding badly enough that even frightened men could see she needed one. Joseph Morgan was elbow-deep in crushed willow bark when the boy burst through his door without knocking. "Orc woman at the gate," the boy gasped. "Big one. Face is torn open. Elder Whitmore says fetch you now. She's the one from the treaty caravan. She's the one they're sending for the marriage arrangement." Joseph was already wiping his hands on his apron and reaching for his satchel before the boy finished the sentence. 10 years of stitching farmers who'd caught a plow blade, soldiers who'd caught worse, and travelers who'd caught the wrong end of canyon country had taught him that when someone said torn open, you did not stop to ask questions you could ask later. He came out into the white glare of the square at a near run, and the whole settlement seemed to be gathering along the rock ledges above to watch, murmuring, some crossing themselves against Orcluck the way old canyon folk still did. And there, in the middle of it, stood the largest, most fearsome, most magnificent woman Joseph Morgan had ever laid eyes on. She was tall enough to look down at most of the men around her, built with a warrior's dense strength beneath a fitted leather bodice laced tight across her collarbone, the leather dark and old, and clearly well cared for despite the fresh blood soaking into it. A war skirt of overlapping hide panels hung from a wide bronze-studded belt over close-fitted leggings, and hide wrappings ran up her forearms where a heavy falchion still hung sheathed at her hip, as if even wounded she would not be parted from it. Her skin was a deep mossy green, weathered by sun and wind, and her dark hair was bound back in a single thick braid threaded with small bone beads. She stood with her spine straight as a spear despite the agony that had to be roaring through her jaw, and her yellow eyes swept the gawking crowd with a contempt that dared any of them to say something about the broken white stub of tusk jutting jagged from her upper lip. Several of them did anyway in low mutters. Joseph heard the word monster. He heard the word ugly. He did not care. He was already moving toward her with his satchel open, and the only thing he was looking at was the amount of blood running down her neck, and the way she was holding her breath against the pain rather than let a single sound escape in front of strangers. "You're bleeding out through the jaw faster than you think you are," he said, stopping close enough to see the damage clearly. "I need to look at that before you decide whether or not you trust me." She turned those yellow eyes on him, and for a moment something like surprise flickered there, as if she had expected him to gawk with the rest of them or flinch or worse, look away in the disgusted pity she plainly hated most of all. "I have had worse," she said through the wreckage of her mouth, the words thick and wet. "I don't doubt it," Joseph said, "but I'd still like to look." She studied him a long moment, a narrow-shouldered man in a stained apron, sandy hair, tired eyes that had clearly seen a great deal of blood and not flinched from any of it, hands scarred with small burns from tinctures gone wrong. Nothing about him was impressive to look at. She had expected, if the human elders sent anyone to greet her at all, some captain in polished mail, some important man puffed up with the honor of it. Instead, they had sent this quiet, ordinary man with kind eyes who was looking at her broken face like it was simply a wound to be tended, and nothing more. "Do what you must," she said finally, and let him lead her toward the healer's cabin, ignoring the whispers that followed them both across the square like a cold wind. Inside, in the dim red light filtering through the cabin's rock-cut window, Joseph worked with the careful economy of a man who had done this 1,000 times. He cleaned the wound along her jaw, packed it, and then turned his attention to the broken tusk itself, examining the jagged edge with a healer's clinical care rather than a stranger's horror. "This will need filing down," he said. "If I leave it sharp like this, it'll catch on your lip every time you speak, and it'll only get worse. I can smooth it tonight if you'll let me. It won't grow back the way it was. I want you to know that before I start." Grama's jaw tightened, and for the first time since the raiders had scattered, something other than pain moved across her face. Shame, quick and fierce, gone almost before he saw it. "Say it," she said. "You may as well, broken and ugly. I have heard it already twice since I crossed your gate." Joseph set down his file and looked at her properly, the way he rarely allowed himself to look at anyone, patient and unhurried. "I did not come here to look at what's broken," he said quietly. "I came to see who is still standing after 2 men tried to put her in the ground and failed. That is what I am looking at right now. I have not looked at your tusk twice since I walked in, and I am not going to start." She stared at him. Whatever answer she had braced herself for, it had not been that. "You do not know me," she said, guarded, testing him the way she tested every blade before she trusted it in a fight. "You do not know what I have done or what I have failed to do. You are looking at a stranger and deciding she has a heart worth noticing." "I'm a healer," Joseph said, picking the file back up. "I've had my hands inside more chests than I can count, Grama Ashwalker. I know what a heart looks like when it's beating scared behind a wall somebody built to keep it safe. Yours is beating plenty hard right now. That's all I noticed. Now hold still, this next part is going to hurt, and I would rather you curse at me in your own language than bite through what's left of that tusk." She laughed then, short and startled and painful against her ruined jaw, but real. It was the first time in longer than she could remember that anyone had made her laugh instead of flinch. "I do not know your customs, human," she said. "But among my people, a man who speaks so plainly to a woman holding a sword usually finds out very quickly whether he meant it." "Among mine," Joseph said, working the file in careful strokes. A man who lies to a woman bleeding on his table usually finds out very quickly he shouldn't have. She let him finish the work in silence after that, though her eyes never left him, tracking his hands, his face, the careful competence of him, as if she were memorizing something she had not expected to find. The council met the next evening in the long hall carved into the canyon's northern wall, torchlight throwing huge shadows against the red stone. And it was there that Joseph Morgan learned exactly what the elders of Rimrock Hollow intended to do with the wounded orc woman he had spent half the night tending. Elder Whitmore, a heavy-set man with a magistrate's chain of office and a face permanently creased with worry, laid it out plainly enough. The Ashwalker clan had sent Grama as their envoy, and more than an envoy, a bride, offered in the old frontier way, to bind the human settlement and the Ashwalker orcs together against the Bloodfang raiders whose warlord Gurak had been carving a bloody path down every trade road in the canyon country for 2 seasons. Without the Ashwalker warriors at their backs, Rimrock Hollow would fall to Gurak's raids within a year, its cliffs breached, its wells poisoned, its people scattered or worse. The Ashwalker chieftain wanted the same guarantee in return: human steel and human medicine, standing beside her people when Gurak came for them next, as everyone knew he would. A marriage would seal it, not a love match. A treaty with vows instead of ink, because vows in canyon country were harder to break than paper and impossible to forge. "We need a man willing to stand as her husband," Whitmore said, looking around the hall at the assembled council. "Someone whose loss, should this alliance fail and Gurak come regardless, would not cripple this settlement's leadership. Someone steady, someone the Ashwalker woman might actually tolerate standing beside." Magistrate Corwin Hale, thin and sour-faced, made no effort to hide his disgust. "You are asking us to hand one of our own to a monster with a broken face and call it diplomacy." "I am asking you to look at the alternative," Whitmore said. "Gurak's raiders killed 40 in Miller's Crossing last spring. 40, Corwin. This canyon has maybe 200 souls in it total." The hall fell into arguing, voices climbing over one another, and through all of it Joseph sat near the back with his satchel still over his shoulder, thinking of yellow eyes that had not flinched from him and a laugh that had cracked through pain like sunlight through a canyon wall. "I'll do it," he said, and the hall went quiet. Whitmore blinked at him. "Joseph, you understand what is being asked." "I understand you need a man nobody important will miss," Joseph said without bitterness, because it was simply true and he had made peace with the truth of his own smallness in this settlement a long time ago. "I'm the apothecary. I patch farmers and bury the ones I can't save, and nobody names a street after me for it. I'm exactly the kind of man you can afford to lose if this goes wrong. So let it be me instead of some man with a family who needs him more than this town needs me." It was not romantic. It was not the answer of a man swept away by anything but plain practical courage. And that, more than anything else, was what made Elder Whitmore nod slowly, and the council fall silent around him. Grama Ashwalker was told the arrangement that same night, standing in the mouth of the healer's cabin with her jaw still bound in clean linen, and her first reaction was a low, dangerous laugh that had nothing warm in it at all. "They give me their apothecary," she said to the Ashwalker guard who brought the news, loud enough that Joseph, coming up the path with a fresh poultice, heard every word. "Not their captain, not a man of standing, the healer who patches the men who matter. Tell your elders I understand exactly what they think of me." Joseph stopped in the path, satchel in hand, and something in him that had absorbed a lifetime of being overlooked without complaint finally spoke up before he could stop it. "They didn't send me because they think little of you," he said, stepping into the torchlight. "I offered because I think little of the idea of good men dying for want of an alliance nobody had the nerve to seal. If that insults you, I understand. But don't mistake my choosing this for them choosing it for you. I chose it." Grama turned, surprised a second time by this quiet man who kept refusing to behave the way she expected any human man to behave. You would marry a stranger, she said slowly, with a broken face, to save a canyon full of people who spit words like monster behind your back the moment you turn. I've buried people who spat worse words at me than that and meant it about me, Joseph said. I've made peace with what this settlement thinks of me a long time ago, Grama Ashwalker. What I haven't made peace with is watching more men die on my table when there was a chance to stop it. You're that chance. I'm not marrying an alliance. I'm marrying the woman who put 2 raiders in the dirt to protect a wagon of grain that wasn't even hers to protect. That woman, I don't mind standing beside at all. For a long moment she only looked at him, the torchlight catching the sharp planes of her face, the terrible pride in the way she held her chin despite the ruin of her jaw, and something in her guarded heart, walled up tight since long before she had ever seen this canyon, cracked open just wide enough to let a single, dangerous thought through. This one might be worth trusting. Then we will pretend well enough that even Gurak's spies believe it, she said at last, turning the moment back into something safer, something that did not ask her to feel anything at all. A performance, apothecary, nothing more. I do not give my heart to arrangements made by frightened councilmen. Understood, Joseph said, and if there was a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, he was wise enough not to let her see it just then. A performance. I can manage that. He had, in fact, no idea how badly he would fail at keeping it that. The pretending began in earnest 3 days later, once Grama's jaw had healed enough to bear weight and speech without agony, and Rimrock Hollow watched with open curiosity and quieter suspicion as the humble apothecary and the fearsome Ashwalker warrior walked the market lane together for the first time as a promised pair. It should have been simple. Joseph had rehearsed it in his head: walk beside her, speak courteously, let the watching town see enough affection to believe the treaty was real. He had not accounted for how difficult it would be to perform closeness with a woman who made his pulse climb every time she looked sideways at him with that dry, dangerous amusement in her yellow eyes. You walk like a man who has never had a woman on his arm, Grama observed, watching him keep a careful, respectful half-step of distance as they passed the grain stalls. I've had precisely no women on my arm, Joseph admitted. I've had women bleeding on my table, which I imagine doesn't count the same way. It does not, she agreed. Come closer, apothecary, unless you want your elders thinking their marriage bargain is already failing before the ink of it dries. He stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off her, close enough to catch the faint smell of leather and wood smoke and something underneath that was simply her, and found his heartbeat doing something entirely inconvenient for a man who was only supposed to be performing. Better? He asked, voice rougher than he meant it to sound. Passable, Grama said, though the corner of her mouth, still healing, twitched upward. For a man who has never done this. They were 3 stalls further along, examining dried peppers neither of them had any real interest in when the trouble started. A cluster of men near the well, drink already loosening their tongues though the sun had not yet reached noon, began muttering loud enough to carry. Look at Morgan, walking that beast like she's a proper woman. Broken-faced thing. Wonder what she looks like under that leather. Probably scarred up worse than her jaw. Whitmore's mad, giving her to Morgan. Should have given her to Hale's dogs, and let her earn her keep some other way. Grama's spine went rigid beside him, her hand drifting, slow and deliberate, toward the hilt of her falchion, and Joseph understood in that instant that she was not afraid of these men in the slightest. She was deciding, with terrible calm, exactly how many of them she could put on the ground before the town turned entirely against the alliance she had come so far to save. He stepped in front of her before she could decide. That's enough, Joseph said, and his voice, usually so mild, carried an edge none of them had heard from him before. He looked at the loudest of the men, a broad-shouldered teamster named Garrick who had once come to Joseph's table with a shattered hand and left with all 5 fingers still attached because Joseph had spent 6 sleepless hours making sure of it. Garrick, Joseph said, I set every bone in that hand of yours myself. I remember exactly how much you cried doing it. So you'll forgive me if I don't feel much need to stand here and let you talk about the woman who's agreed to marry me like she's livestock at auction." Garrick's face went red, but something in Joseph's flat, unhurried tone made him look away first. "No offense meant, Morgan," he muttered. "Plenty was meant," Joseph said. "I'll let it go this once if you do the same." He turned back to Grama, who was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. Not gratitude, not quite, something sharper and more complicated than that, something that looked almost like she had not expected to be defended at all, let alone by a man half her size and none of her strength. "You did not need to do that," she said quietly as they walked on. "I have broken worse men than him with my bare hands." "I know," Joseph said. "But you shouldn't have to, not here, not while I'm standing next to you." "You are an unusual man, Joseph Morgan," she said, and there was nothing dry or teasing in it this time. "So I've been told," he said, and this time he let himself smile at her, and this time she did not look away. The weeks that followed carved a strange and precious rhythm into both their lives. By day, Joseph tended his patients and Grama trained with the small handful of Ashwalker warriors who had remained in Rimrock Hollow, and every evening they walked the canyon lane together for the town to see, a performance that grew less and less like one with each passing day. She began coming to his cabin uninvited, sharpening her falchion by his fire, while he ground herbs at his workbench, filling his small, quiet rooms with a presence he had not realized how badly he'd missed having in his life. "You have very steady hands," she said one evening, watching him measure willow bark with a precision that came from years of practice. "For a man who claims to be unimportant, steady hands aren't the same as important," Joseph said. "Any fool can learn steady hands with enough practice and enough people bleeding in front of them." "Do not do that," Grama said sharply, setting down her whetstone. "Do what?" "Make yourself smaller than you are. I have watched you work. I have watched you stand between me and men twice my size in numbers, if not in strength, without a blade in your hand. That is not nothing, apothecary. Among my people, a warrior who stands unarmed between danger and someone she has sworn to protect is called brave. I will not sit here and listen to you call it nothing." Joseph set down his mortar and looked at her, startled by the fierceness in her voice. "I've never been called brave before," he said. "Then the people of this canyon are fools," Grama said, "and I begin to understand why they sent me their least important man. He is, apparently, the only one worth having." It was around the fire that night, the flames low and the canyon quiet outside, that Joseph finally worked up the nerve to ask about the Tusk. "You don't have to tell me," he said carefully, "but I've wondered. A break that clean, that deliberate, that wasn't just battle luck." Grama went still, her fingers tightening on the whetstone. "It was Gurak," she said finally. "2 winters passed. He came to my aunt's camp claiming right of challenge for my hand, as Bloodfang custom allows when a chieftain's kin refuses an offered marriage. I refused him 3 times. The 4th time he did not ask. He simply broke what he could not have, so that no other orc male would want me after, marked as refused and ruined. That is Bloodfang custom too. A woman who will not bend is made ugly, so she cannot be given to anyone else. I have worn it since as a warning to any man who might think me worth the trouble." Joseph felt something hot and furious rise in his chest, entirely unfamiliar, entirely unlike his usual careful calm. "He's wrong," Joseph said. "About all of it. You're not ruined. You're not a warning. You're the fiercest thing I have ever seen in my life, and any man who can't see past a broken tusk to the woman standing behind it doesn't deserve to look at you at all." Grama's yellow eyes shone too bright in the firelight, and for once she did not have a sharp answer ready. "You keep saying things like that," she said, voice rough, "as though you mean them." "I do mean them," Joseph said, "every time." He reached out, slow and careful, the way he might reach toward a wounded animal that had learned the world only bit back, and brushed his thumb along the jagged edge of her broken tusk, so gently she barely felt the pressure at all. "This is just a scar," he said softly. "It doesn't change what I see when I look at you." "And what do you see?" she breathed, closer now than performance required, closer than pretending ever demanded. Someone worth choosing, Joseph said, even if the choosing was supposed to be an act. She closed the last of the distance herself, her hand curling into the front of his shirt, and kissed him, not gentle, not careful, but fierce and hungry and long overdue. The kiss of a woman who had spent 2 years convincing herself she was unwantable and had just been handed proof otherwise. Joseph answered her without hesitation, one hand rising to cradle her jaw with the same careful reverence he used on every wound he had ever tended, as though she were something precious rather than something broken. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, Grama rested her forehead against his and laughed, low and startled. "So much for pretending," she said. "So much for pretending," Joseph agreed, and neither of them tried to take it back. The trouble that ended the pretending entirely arrived 11 days later in the shape of a rider half dead on a foundering horse, carrying word that shattered the fragile peace of the canyon. A fever had swept through the Ashwalker camp in the high country, brought in on trade goods from a southern route, and it was killing the old and the young fastest of all. The clan's healers had exhausted their stores of fever-bane and bloodroot. Without proper medicine within the week, the chieftain's own sister, Grama's mother, would likely die alongside dozens of others, and with her, quite possibly, the alliance itself, since a clan gutted by plague made a poor ally against Gurak's spears. Rimrock Hollow's stores held exactly what was needed. Joseph knew the recipe, had ground the bloodroot himself, understood the dosing that meant the difference between a cure and a poison. But the fastest road to the Ashwalker camp ran directly through Deadfall Pass, a stretch of hostile canyon country that Gurak's raiders patrolled like hungry wolves, and no wagon train had crossed it safely in over a month. "I have to go," Joseph said, already packing his satchel with every vial and pouch he owned. "Nobody else knows the dosing. If I send the medicine without going myself and something's wrong with the mix, it kills instead of cures." "Then I am going with you," Grama said, already reaching for her falchion. "Whitmore won't like it. Your people sent you here to be safe, to seal the alliance, not to go riding back into Bloodfang country. Whitmore is not the one whose mother is dying," Grama said, and there was nothing performance about the steel in her voice now. "I did not survive Gurak's hammer to sit safe in a canyon cabin while my family burns with fever, Joseph. You are not crossing Deadfall Pass without me at your side. That is not a request." He looked at her, at the fierce certainty in her yellow eyes, and felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a strange, fierce gladness that she would not let him go alone. "All right," he said. "Together, then." They left before dawn with 2 pack mules, a small escort of 3 Ashwalker warriors and 1 nervous Rimrock Hollow guardsman named Tam who had begged to come along for the honor of it, and rode into the red teeth of Deadfall Pass as the sun climbed hot and merciless overhead. The pass lived up to its name twice over. On the second day, Bloodfang scouts spotted their dust trail and gave chase, and it was only Grama's knowledge of the old goat trails, learned as a girl running these same canyons, that got them off the main road and into a narrow defile where the raiders' horses could not follow. They spent a tense, silent night pressed against cold rock while raider torches passed within 100 yards, and Joseph, huddled close against Grama's side for warmth and safety both, found himself memorizing the steady thump of her heart against his ear as though it were the only sound in the world worth trusting. On the 4th day, crossing a dry riverbed, Tam's mule stumbled and threw its pack, and it was Joseph who scrambled down the loose scree to retrieve the medicine crate before it shattered on the rocks below, and Grama who caught him by the back of his belt when his own footing gave way, hauling him bodily back up onto solid ground with a strength that left him breathless and laughing despite the danger. "You are going to give me gray hairs before either of us reach 30, she said, hands still fisted in his shirt, refusing to let go even once the danger had passed. "You're the one who taught me the trail was faster this way," Joseph said, grinning up at her. "I did not tell you to fling yourself down a cliff for a crate of bloodroot. I wasn't flinging myself anywhere. I was retrieving your dowry." "My dowry," Grama repeated, arching a brow, "is a crate of medicine you nearly died for." "Better than a dowry of goats," Joseph said. "Goats never once saved anyone's mother from fever." She laughed then, loud and unguarded, the sound echoing off the canyon walls, and kissed him hard right there on the scree slope with their escort politely pretending not to notice. And Joseph understood with a clarity that startled him that whatever this had started as, it had become the realest thing in his entire life. They reached the Ashwalker camp on the 6th day, exhausted, sunburned, and triumphant, the medicine crates intact, and Joseph spent 2 days and nights barely sleeping as he measured doses and walked the healers through the mixing, watching fevers break one by one across the camp until the worst of the danger had passed. Grama's mother, weak but alive, gripped his hand with surprising strength when he finally allowed himself to rest, and looked at him with the same sharp yellow eyes her daughter had. "You came for a woman your council thought was worth nothing," the old orc woman said, "and you saved a whole camp doing it." "My daughter chose well, apothecary, whatever bargain first brought you to her door." It was there in the Ashwalker camp that Grama's Aunt Vashka, the clan's war chief, a scarred and formidable woman who studied Joseph with open skepticism before finally nodding her approval, told him the rest of what Grama had never fully said aloud, that Gurek had wanted Grama for himself long before any human alliance existed, had asked for her hand 3 times and been refused 3 times, because she would not be claimed by a man who ruled through fear rather than earned loyalty, and that the broken Tusk had been his answer to a pride he could not conquer any other way. "He will not let this go," Vashka warned, her voice low and grim. "A human husband is worse insult to him than any refusal. He will come for her again, apothecary, and probably for you as well, before this is finished. Are you prepared for that?" "I've been prepared to defend her since the day I saw her walk through my town gate bleeding and still standing taller than every man watching her," Joseph said. "I'm not stopping now." Vashka studied him a long moment, then extended her forearm in the warrior's clasp, an honor Joseph did not fully understand until Grama, watching from across the fire with fierce pride shining in her eyes, told him later that it meant the clan considered him one of their own from that day forward. They returned to Rimrock Hollow 2 weeks later with the alliance no longer a fragile piece of paper, but something forged in shared danger and blood and medicine. And Elder Whitmore, relieved beyond words that both the treaty and his settlement's apothecary had survived Deadfall Pass intact, declared that the marriage would be held within the month, a full public ceremony blending both human and Ashwalker custom, to seal the alliance before the whole canyon and send unmistakable word to Gurek that his ambitions ended at Rimrock Hollow's gates. It should have been a joyful month. In many ways it was. Grama and Joseph no longer needed to pretend anything at all, and the town, having watched them ride into danger and back for the sake of a dying woman neither of them owed anything to, largely warmed to them both, even Garrick the teamster offering a gruff, awkward apology one market morning that Grama accepted with more grace than Joseph expected. But Magistrate Hale remained cold and watchful, muttering that no good would come of binding the settlement's fate so tightly to orc quarrels, and worse, Ashwalker scouts began reporting Bloodfang war parties massing along the eastern ridges in numbers no one had seen in a generation. Gurek was coming. Everyone who mattered knew it. The only question was when, and Vashka's warning that he would not simply let Grama go sat heavy over every wedding preparation like a storm cloud that refused to break. The wedding day arrived bright and merciless, the canyon sun turning the red cliffs to burning copper, and the whole of Rimrock Hollow's central square had been transformed for the occasion. Long tables groaned under roasted meat and canyon wine. Ashwalker banners hung beside human ones from the cliff ledges. A raised dais had been built against the western rock face, garlanded with desert blooms, and both peoples gathered below it in numbers larger than the canyon had seen in years, humans in their market day best, Ashwalker warriors in polished leathers and bone jewelry, Vashka herself standing at the dais steps in ceremonial war paint to speak the clan's blessing. Grama stood at the top of the dais in ceremonial garb adapted from her warrior's leathers, the same fitted bodice she had worn since the day she arrived, now trimmed with beaten bronze at the collar and cuffs, her war skirt replaced with a longer ceremonial version dyed deep red to match the canyon stone, her falchion still belted at her hip because, as she had informed Joseph flatly the night before, no Ashwalker bride went anywhere unarmed, treaty or no treaty. Her dark hair had been unbound from its usual braid and threaded instead with small white desert flowers, and standing there with the sun catching the proud lines of her face, broken tusk and all, she was, to Joseph's eyes, the single most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He stood across from her in his best coat, hands steadier than he expected given how hard his heart was hammering, and Elder Whitmore had just begun the joined blessing human vows first, then Vashka's clan words to follow, when the first horn sounded from the eastern ridge. It was not a ceremonial horn. Screams erupted from the cliff walkways above the square as painted raiders came pouring down ropes and goat trails they had scouted for weeks, dozens of them. Gurak himself striding through the settlement's shattered eastern gate with his warhammer, already bloody from the 2 guardsmen who had tried to bar his way. He was enormous, a full head taller than Grama, his tusks filed to deliberate points, and his eyes fixed on the dais with the terrible satisfaction of a man who had been planning this exact moment of chaos for a very long time. "I heard there was a wedding," Gurak bellowed, his voice carrying over the screaming crowd. "I have come to correct an insult. Ashwalker blood does not bind itself to a human healer, while I yet live to claim what refused me twice already." The square erupted into panic, townsfolk scattering, Ashwalker warriors drawing steel, and Elder Whitmore stumbling backward off the dais in terror. Grama's falchion was already in her hand, her ceremonial calm shattered into pure battle focus, and she stepped down from the dais to meet Gurak's advance without a single flicker of hesitation. "You broke my tusk and called it a warning," she snarled. "You will find out today what it warned you of." It was in that moment, with Gurak's raiders spilling into the square and Rimrock Hollow's guards scrambling to form a ragged line, that Joseph Morgan, humble apothecary, the man the council had chosen because his loss would matter least, did the one thing every instinct of the last 10 years had trained him never to do in the face of overwhelming danger. He refused to stay silent, and he refused to stay behind. "She is not yours to claim," Joseph shouted, loud enough that it carried across the chaos, stepping forward from the dais steps to stand directly in Gurak's path, unarmed but for the small belt knife he used to cut bandages. "You broke her tusk because you couldn't break her spirit, and you're here today because you still can't. I don't care how big your hammer is. I'm not moving, and neither is she." The square, for one strange suspended heartbeat, went almost silent, humans and orcs alike staring at the small, unimportant apothecary standing his ground before the most feared warlord in the canyon country. Gurak laughed, a booming, ugly sound. "This is what they gave you, Grama Ashwalker, a little healer with a paring knife. I will break him in front of you, and then I will take what should have been mine from the start." "You will try," Grama said and lunged. What followed was not the ordered spectacle of a duel but a churning, brutal melee, Ashwalker warriors meeting Bloodfang raiders in a clash of steel across the wedding tables, wine and blood splashing alike across the red stone, banners torn down and trampled underfoot. Tam and a knot of Rimrock Hollow guardsmen held the western approach with spears leveled, buying precious space, while Vashka herself waded into the fray roaring her clan's war cry, cutting down 2 raiders in as many strokes. Joseph did not run, though every survival instinct screamed at him too. Instead, he did the only thing he knew how to do under fire. He moved through the chaos toward the wounded, dragging a fallen guardsman clear of a raider's swinging axe, using his belt knife to cut free a fallen banner rope, and lash it around a burning table leg to slow the spread of an overturned brazier's fire before it could catch the whole square alight. When a raider turned on him mid-retreat, blade raised, Joseph flung a jar of concentrated fever-bane tincture full into the man's eyes, the alcohol-sharp liquid blinding him long enough for Tam to finish the fight with a spear thrust. Across the square, Grama fought like something out of the old canyon songs, her broken tusk bared in a snarl, driving Gurak back step by step through sheer, relentless fury. Every blow she landed a payment for 2 years of humiliation finally being called due. Gurak was strong and heavy with his warhammer, but Grama was faster, angrier, and fighting for something he had never once understood. Not conquest, not claim, but love freely chosen. And that fury drove her blade past his guard again and again, until his warhammer arm hung useless and bleeding at his side. He swung wild and desperate with his offhand, and Grama caught the blow on her forearm guard exactly as she had at Deadfall Pass, then answered with a strike that shattered his jaw and sent 2 of his own filed tusks skittering across the bloodied stone. A mirror, savage and exact, of the wound he had once given her. Gurak went down hard, gasping, broken, his raiders faltering and scattering at the sight of their warlord beaten, in front of both clans and the humans they had come to conquer. Within minutes the fight collapsed entirely, Bloodfang raiders fleeing back up the cliff trails they had descended, leaving their wounded and their shattered warlord behind on the ruined wedding stones. Joseph reached Grama's side just as the last of the fighting died into ragged silence across the square, both of them breathless, singed, spattered with blood that was mostly not their own, standing amid overturned tables and trampled desert flowers, and the wreckage of what had, an hour ago, been the most carefully planned wedding the canyon had ever seen. He looked at her filthy, furious, magnificent, her ceremonial red skirt torn at the hem, flowers scattered from her unbound hair, broken tusk bared in a fierce, exhausted grin, and something in the absurdity of it all, the sheer impossible relief of both of them still standing, broke loose in his chest as a laugh he could not have held back if he tried. Grama stared at him for one startled second and then began laughing too, helpless, unguarded laughter that shook through her whole body, the 2 of them standing together in the ruins of their own wedding, while Ashwalker warriors bound Gurak in his own war chains a few paces away, and Tam whooped in triumph atop an overturned table. "Some wedding," Joseph managed between breaths. "You unarmed man," Grama gasped, still laughing, pulling him against her by the front of his ruined coat. "You stood in front of Gurak's hammer with a paring knife and a jar of tincture. It worked, didn't it?" "It was the single most reckless thing I have ever seen," she said, "and I have watched you retrieve medicine crates off a cliff face." "You love reckless," Joseph said, grinning up at her. "I love you," Grama said, and the laughter faded from her face into something far more solemn, far more true, the words landing between them with the weight of every guarded wall she had spent 2 years building finally coming all the way down. "I did not intend to. I told myself it was only pretending, only a performance for frightened councilmen and watching spies. But you have never once looked at what was broken in me, Joseph Morgan. Not my face, not my pride, not the parts of me I have kept locked away since Gurak decided I was worth ruining rather than losing. You noticed only the heart underneath it, from the very first hour, bleeding on your table. I did not know a man could do that until you did." Joseph reached up and brushed a fallen flower petal from her tangled hair, his throat tight, his own eyes stinging in a way he had no interest in hiding from her. "I noticed the heart because it was the strongest thing in the room," he said. "It still is. I love you too, Grama. Not the treaty, not the performance. You, I think I have since the moment you laughed at my joke with half your jaw held together by linen and refused to let it stop you." Around them, the square was slowly coming back to itself, guardsmen riding overturned tables, Ashwalker warriors tending their wounded elder Whitmore emerging pale, but unharmed from behind a rain barrel to survey the wreckage of what had, against every expectation, still succeeded in its purpose. Gurak lay chained and broken, his own tusks shattered on the stones, his raiders scattered into the hills without a warlord to follow, and Vashka strode toward the dais with grim satisfaction plain on her painted face. "The alliance holds," she announced to the gathered crowd, her voice carrying across the ruined square. "It was forged in fever and blood before it was ever forged in vows, and it is stronger for it. Gurak's threat to this canyon ends today, chained by his own arrogance and broken by the very woman he thought he could ruin twice." She looked at Grama and Joseph, still holding tight to one another amid the wreckage, and something almost like warmth softened her scarred face. "Finish it properly, apothecary. My niece did not survive that hammer twice to be married in half a ceremony." Elder Whitmore, dusting broken flowers from his coat with as much dignity as he could muster, cleared his throat and climbed back onto the shattered edge of the dais. "Well," he said, a little unsteadily, "I suppose we had better finish what we started before the wine spoils entirely." Laughing, bloodied, utterly unwilling to let go of one another, Joseph Morgan and Grama Ashwalker climbed back onto the ruined dais hand in hand. And there, amid overturned tables and trampled flowers and the chained, defeated warlord who had once tried to break her, they spoke their vows properly at last. No longer a performance, no longer a treaty dressed up as a marriage, but two hearts that had found each other in the worst possible circumstances and refused, ever since, to let go. When Grama leaned down to kiss him this time, before the whole canyon, before both their peoples cheering and weeping and laughing in the wreckage together, there was nothing guarded left in it at all. They spent that evening not at any grand feast, for the tables were mostly ruined and the wine mostly spilled, but sitting together on the canyon's western ledge as the sun went down blood-red and gold over the rocks, Joseph's arm around Grama's shoulders, her head resting against him with a contentment she had not allowed herself to feel in years. "You could have run, you know," she said quietly, watching the last light fade over the ridges. "When Gurak came through that gate, any sensible man would have run." "I've never been especially sensible," Joseph said, "just steady. There's a difference." "There is," Grama agreed, and turned her head to look at him, her yellow eyes soft in the dying light, her broken tusk no longer something she tried to hide when she smiled. "I think I prefer steady in the end. I have had enough men in my life who thought bigness and hardness were the same thing as strength. You taught me otherwise, apothecary, without ever once needing a warhammer to do it." "You taught me something too," Joseph said, tightening his arm around her. "I spent a long time thinking a man like me didn't get chosen for anything that mattered. Turns out, I just hadn't met the right woman yet to do the choosing." "I chose you the day you told me you'd looked at me twice, and neither time had you looked at my tusk," Grama murmured. "I have not stopped choosing you since. I do not intend to start." Below them, the canyon settled into its evening hush, torches being relit along the cliff walkways, voices rising in relieved, exhausted laughter as Ashwalker and human alike began the slow work of clearing the wreckage and salvaging what remained of the feast. Somewhere among them, Tam was already loudly retelling the story of the wedding day battle to anyone who would listen, embellishing Joseph's role with each new telling, until the apothecary sounded like something closer to a legend than a healer with a jar of tincture. Joseph did not mind. He sat on the ledge with the woman who had chosen him above every other man she might have had, watched the canyon stars come out one by one over the red cliffs, and understood, with a certainty that settled deep and warm in his chest, that whatever guarded walls either of them had carried into this strange, dangerous, unlikely marriage, there was nothing left between them now but the plain, unshielded truth of two hearts that had found exactly where they belonged. "Husband," Grama said, testing the word slowly, as if trying its weight for the first time. "Wife," Joseph answered, and found he liked the sound of it a great deal. She kissed him again there on the ledge, unhurried this time, with all the fierce tenderness of a woman who no longer needed to guard anything at all. And below them, the canyon settlement of Rimrock Hollow, battered but unbroken, began the long, hopeful work of building a future neither humans nor orcs had dared imagine before a wounded bride walked through its gates with a broken tusk, and a heart that one quiet, ordinary man had refused to look away from.